We now take a look at Zambia with Hannah Edinger. She is Head of Research at Frontier Advisory Matlotleng Matlou, CEO of AISA. Lady and gentlemen, thank you for coming through. At the end of our discussion, as discussed, I'm going to ask you, is Zambia a hot destination or not? But right now, let's discuss the merits of whether Zambia is indeed a worthy destination or not, particularly since the incoming administration of Michael Sata and some of the policy changes that he has initiated. If I could begin with you, Hannah. Sata has come in on a raft of promises from the electorate, and understandably, he has implemented change. Overall, has that change been good or for the worse?
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for those questions. Maybe just to backtrack a few years, I think Zambia is really, really reflects the paradox that we have in Africa again. The difference of such resource wealth, given that it is the 7th largest reserve holder of copper, the 4th largest reserve holder of cobalt, since 1964 in independence, and 5 decades effectively of independence, but these riches haven't really filtered through to the ground. So we're seeing about 70% of the population still living in poverty, about a third still in extreme poverty. And part of the campaigning that came from Michael Sata absolutely was exactly that. Right. Since the MMD was in power for the last 20 years, we haven't really seen those benefits filter through to the grassroots. And that was definitely part of his campaigning. And it will be really, really hard for him to implement those policies. So what we've been seeing is very much a pro-labor, pro-poor focus that was confirmed in the budget that was announced for 2012 on the 11th of November. Right. With the tangibles of really putting money back into the people's pockets, but also creating more inclusive employment opportunities, job creation, more local investment and private sector development. Right. Just as much, and married to that is the big drive on corruption and cracking down on corruption. Right. Over the last few years, Bretton Woods institutions and traditional partners have actually restrained financing to Zambia on about 3 occasions or so, given incidences of corruption, mismanagement of funding, etc., etc. Yeah. But just as much, so there've been a number of changes in various offices. The central bank governor was dismissed. We'll
debate the merits of whether that was the right thing or not.
But just as much, I think what's quite important is that there is the signalling of macroeconomic stability that is coming through based on the 6th National Development Plan that was announced earlier this year, and certain macroeconomic policies that will be continued with perhaps a greater expenditure and fiscal focus on socio-economic development and local opportunities.
So what's your view? Your view is that he has been a force for good for now?
For now, I mean, it's far too early to tell.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think we also need to look at where he's coming from and what his own history is. Yeah. Yesterday in our discussion, one of the colleagues noted he shoots from the hip. And maybe, he's perhaps not as diplomatic as some of the other diplomats have been. But it's time for him to prove himself. And this is the opportunity for him, He will learn. He will learn.
He will learn the diplomacy. Matlou, let me come to you. She paints a picture of a state where an incoming administration needed to make changes and has made some changes. The overall question I'm asking, I guess, is that have these changes been positive or negative, or more positive than they have been negative?
Well, I think we must congratulate the Zambian people and the Zambian government in this year, 2011, on the African continent.
On the policy changes?
In terms of change of government.
Oh, change of government.
There have been 29 elections, and we see what has happened in the DRC, so I think it's important that we make that point.
No, that's absolutely
He's only been in power for 2 months now. So
and he has made a lot of announcements and pronouncements.
Look, he came on a campaign promise. Yeah. He said, look, 90 days, I'm going to do a number of things. He's trimmed down his cabinet. He's appointed an anti-corruption SAR. The budget has come out, as Hannah said, which is a pro-poor budget, which is part of what he has spoken about. There is a need to create jobs, high unemployment in Zambia, a lot of corruption that must be dealt with. So in that regard, yes, I think that the MMD, being incumbents from 1991, maybe we're becoming complacent.
Yeah, but we do know that from history, and you don't have to look further than the southern neighbor, which is Zimbabwe. When you go pro-poor and you grow pro-poor too much, you kill the goose. We look back into Zimbabwe and we saw the massive investments that were made into education. We saw the massive investments that were made into health. But there was no base created to keep the base that was making those resources available ticking. Are we in danger here in Zambia of running into the same problem?
I think we must be careful, I mean, in making judgments and comparing. I mean, Zimbabwe, it's not that the issue of the pro was necessarily the main problem. I think a lot of poor governance would have crept in. The important thing would be that these policies are based on clear, definable goals. I think it is important that there is a civil society that keeps government in check. I think that spending must be on the basis of also collecting taxes properly. It's one of the biggest problems on the African continent, that the challenges for mining companies and others coming into countries like that is the tax collected, is it used properly, is the service delivery? So I think those are important, those must underpin the process of governance in Zambia.
So what are you saying? Are you saying that the changes that have been made were necessary?
Well,
So
take the issue of corruption, for example. I think it's important. People in Zambia were complaining that the public service had become very corrupt, the issues of tenders, nepotism, and so on and so forth. That's at one level. I think that there was also the issue of foreign investors in certain cases in terms of some of the deals that were done with Zambia, whether there was proper revenue coming back to the government. I think the government is talking about re-looking at the windfall tax, which was withdrawn in 2009. And as Ms. Edinger has also said, I mean, with all these reserves, I think it's part of the Dutch disease that we see in a number of African countries. If you compare with some of the countries in the Middle East or even in North Africa, they have taken their oil wealth and used it to a large extent to develop social development. But in many African countries, maybe from Equatorial Guinea to Nigeria and others, we haven't necessarily seen the benefits of mineral wealth, being transposed into development. Botswana next door, if you say a Southern African neighbor, Botswana next door has done very well in terms of that, and maybe should be a good example for Zambia.
One of the terms that he's come up with, and let's discuss perhaps this, is this phrase around resource inclusion, and it answers in part some of the issues that you raise. The resource inclusion that he is talking about, how feasible is it to implement it at a time when we know that the copper price has reached all-time highs? It's been under pressure this year, but it's still at a very, very high price. And we have a population, in part, largely, that has been excluded from the local economy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there needs to be greater windfalls and greater participation for the local population. The obvious problem is, how do you do that, and how do you include, population? But I think the first and the basic starting point is really salaries, for example, in the mining sector, working conditions in the mining sector. There are sectors, that are underemploying, that are paying lower wages perhaps than what they should be paying. There are conditions that just do not, that are not in line with labor laws, that are not properly enforced, for example. And these companies are getting away with it. I think a lot of finger pointing has, for example, been done to Chinese investors, but they are obviously not, the only investors, or not the largest investors in the Zambian, copper industry and other mineral wealth in the country. I think what's really important in the case of Zambia is that Zambia went through, a phase where it had nationalized its mines, and it really wasn't a successful time period. So looking at the extreme sort of nationalization, I don't think that's a debate. There's no, I think, point of renationalizing any of the assets.
It's resource inclusion that they are talking about, and you're saying that's the right approach.
So there's a lot of talks in terms of, for example, the Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines, for example, which is a state-owned company, of increasing its shares in a number of the operations, which are usually about 10 to 20%, to increase this to about 35%. If this is really going to be on the cards, to what extent, that will really change the operations of these companies, I mean, is to be seen. But I think what's really important, and it was touched on just now, is how do you hold these companies accountable in terms of reporting the correct figures as well, the correct profits, and being able to tax them accordingly.
That's the other issue that we need to talk about, because the next issue that I wanted to raise is around the regulatory environment. But before we go there, I wanted us to touch on another aspect. One of the more dramatic changes that he made was firing the central bank governor. Okay, I use the word firing, they will use a different word. But effectively, his term was terminated before the end of his contract. So in our lingo, he was fired. He's a guy who had been credited with stabilizing inflation in Zambia, and was well respected in international markets. Was that the right move? And was that the right time to take it in terms of a new government coming and sending indications to foreign investors about its intentions going forward?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think when Michael Sata, heard that he had won the election, I think he didn't see it coming. He wasn't prepared.
Right.
And in terms of announcing, his cabinet and really planning and looking out, I think I don't think he had the right time to look ahead.
Sure.
Were the decisions of firing people and getting rid of people in certain offices the right decisions?
Yeah.
Particularly given that his contract wasn't up yet, the term wasn't up yet, and he is respected for X, Y, and Z. The argument could be, well, trying to get rid of persons that aren't.
I understand the political figureheads. I get worried when you're removing part of the state edifice. The bureaucrats, the people who are supposed to keep policy stable. But let me come to you, Matlou. One of the other changes that he also did was, of course, to say that he wanted to create an environment in which the private sector is enabled to get cheaper credit. And I guess part of that plan was getting rid of the central bank governor who had kept high interest rates, some would argue, at the expense of growing the economy. Overall, when we look at those economic policy changes that we see, have they been able, in your view so far, to reduce the cost of borrowing that you wanted to create for the private sector?
Well, I think, the liquidity and availability of resources within the country, part of it coming from taxes, part of it coming from foreign investment, will ease the situation. I think that the extent to which also business is done within Zambia allows for it to ensure that, the issues of liquidity are easier. Obviously, banks would want, in terms of borrowing, things like, collateral. And we know on the African continent, in many cases, people talk about debt collateral, where people have land and it's communally owned and so on and so forth. And we know that Armando Soto, the South American economist, has spoken about this, of trying to find ways in which you can create capital out of so-called dead assets. We know in farming communities, in certain cases, places like Kenya, we have banks, started by women's movements, which have said that, you borrow on the basis of peer pressure.
Sure.
That if your colleagues come together and say, if you don't pay the money back, then we all suffer. So I think there will have to be innovation around those issues. Certainly the issue of stability is important. And again, one would want to say investors are interesting. You look at countries like Angola, Equatorial Guinea, and others. Even though we might talk about lack of good governance in some of these countries, we still have investment pouring in. So the mining sector, certainly in Zambia, will drive the economy moving forward, and we know that Zambia is going to be a fast-growing economy in the coming years, and so foreign investment will be attracted, and that hopefully will create the resources.
My director is telling me that we've run out of time, but I must ask you, and I'm afraid I think I know your answer. Is Zambia hot or not as an investment destination?
It's hot.
It is hot.
No, it definitely continues to be hot. Let's watch what's happening.
I suspected you were both going to say it is hot, and I certainly hope that I'll prove you wrong, or you'll be proved right. I hope you'll be proved right, and I hope I'll be proved wrong in the long run. But thanks very much indeed for joining us. That was Hannah Edinger. She is Head of Research at Frontier Advisory and Matloteng Matlou, CEO of AISA.